we go into, one second, Melinda, I'll get to you. We have adults, so we talked about the womb, we talked about some children, and we certainly can continue there as well. But so we have adults, Dr. Logan, they get into kind of like a pickle, a little bit of a pickle. I hear this a lot. You did when you were pastoring, I'm sure. Just in general conversation, probably still. So male or female, doesn't matter. They want to have a relationship, but the one prior to that really has them in a bad spot, in a bad place. So they kind of live in this press. I want to have this relationship, but this is where I am. This is how I feel, right? That whole sunburn thing. How do you suggest that they begin to make progress in that? Because the other person on the other side of that, who they may want to enter into that relationship, like you said, they can show them a sunburn, but they cannot show them what's going on inside. So how does that person start to, try to work through that process of wanting to be in that relationship? Because again, the other person may not understand, and they'll just say, I'm out of here because of what I've seen in this person. And let's be honest, they'll probably just say, I think that person's crazy, and that's just where they'll leave it. So how does a person that wants to be in a relationship but may not know that they're really dealing with some trauma, even as an adult, bridge that?
To recover from trauma, is recovery possible? Sure, absolutely. Is recovery possible for everybody? It's possible, but it won't always be the same picture. It won't look the same. All right. So there's a couple words we work with: recovery and resiliency. So we build towards resiliency in the hope that it's going to bring recovery. We build towards resiliency in the hope that we will find recovery. But there are two essential elements that have to be in place. And they're not going to be in place up front. You have to work towards this. But eventually you have to have both of these factors in order to experience recovery. Number one, no one recovers from trauma alone. I said this in Marriage Matters last weekend, and it's very true here as well. We require a voice from outside of ourselves to show us what we can't see. That can happen with a counselor and therapist. That can happen with a close friend. But there are some really important elements that have to be a part of this voice that's outside of us speaking back to us. There's some real important components that have to be present. And number one, it has to be acceptance without judgment and without shame. That understanding that comes from the voice outside of us has to have a level of understanding that at first, I'm not going to trust them. It's difficult enough for me to trust myself. Don't even expect me to trust you. See, this is the essential issue with Israel when God brings them out of Egypt. They haven't been in Egypt a short time. They've been there 4 generations. The people that God is liberating through Moses out of Egypt, they don't even know experientially what freedom is. They've only heard it talked about. No one there living can tell them what it was like. It's handed down stories. They're working with hand-me-downs. And Moses is dispatched by God, filled with his Spirit. And how do they receive this man who's there to help them? Well, they don't. This becomes a trust issue. And so, in a bit, they put a little bit of trust in Moses. And so that's when he turns the water into wine, or not wine, into blood. Wrong story. When he turns the water into blood, and how does Pharaoh, the oppressor, how does he react? He makes life more difficult for the Israelites. Does that make them trust Moses the more? No. In fact, they're asking him to leave. "14 months goes by before all 10 plagues are done. The 10 plagues takes place over approximately a 14-month period. They finally leave. By the way, you won't see this in the English translation of the Bible, but if you were reading it in Hebrew, you would understand 100% of the Jewish population did not leave Egypt with Moses. 20% left. 80% didn't trust him. 80% of the Jews chose to stay with Pharaoh than to follow Moses. That's true. So you have 20%, which, by the way, that 20% equaled about 2 million people. And they follow this guy out into the desert. At that point, they are a 2-week journey to the Promised Land. And how long does it take them to get there? 40 years to go 2 weeks. And how many of those people, of that 2 million, that 20% that left Egypt, how many of them occupies the Promised Land? 2. Because recovery doesn't happen in the same generation. It was the kids they got to go in. That's just one part of trauma recovery. The second part, nobody recovers from trauma alone. The second part is nobody recovers from trauma without showing up for their own rescue.
Oh my gosh! You can't stop right there. You have to take that further. That's really profound because I don't think a lot of people really understand that on other levels of life either. You need to be present, show up on that. So can you take that a little further?
Before I'm with Christian Family Care Agency as an adoption educator and trauma professional. That's what I do now. Before, I was in private practice. And in private practice, I saw a lot of couples whose marriage was in crises, and they were wanting to salvage their marriage. And sometimes it was only one of the pair showing up to my office and initiating the counseling. And so one of the things that I always want to help them understand, and I try to be kind and not give them this on the first visit, but somewhere along the line, I want to help them understand if I, your counselor, am working more on your marriage than you are, then this isn't going to work. Well, the same thing is true if only one of the spouses is working on the marriage and the other one isn't. It's not going to work either. Now, I'm not saying you don't try, because I do say try. And I'm not saying quit prematurely, but I am telling you that if eventually both of you don't show up, it's not going to work. And there's no judgment or shame to that. And there's especially no judgment or shame from God. And I'm not going to get into the divorce thing. We can, but I don't really think that, I think that takes our topic somewhere else. But at some point in time, I would like to talk to you about divorce, because I would like to say to you right now that divorce is not the unpardonable sin that traditional Christianity has represented it to be. I do believe in the sanctity of marriage, and I think if you were at the conference last weekend, you know just how much I represent that message. But I also realize that because we live in a fragmented world, God did not give a wife control over her husband any more than he gave husbands control over the wives. That, husbands, we know for sure. Okay? But, there's very little in life we have control over. That's why unity in the Bible is not defined as sameness, but it's defined as being a volunteer. Well, it's not a volunteer if one person is trying to coax and bring along and talk into the other person, and they're not coming along as a volunteer. And the problem was with Israel in the wilderness was that first generation out of Egypt, they were not all volunteers. And they felt like they were kicking and screaming through the desert. And God still loved them through that. He wasn't lacking compassion for them. He provided for them. In fact, do you know to the extent that God provided for them, they never went without food? The shoes that they were wearing when they left Egypt never wore out 40 years later. Their clothes never were torn or got holes in them or wore out. The clothes that they were wearing when they left Egypt was still as if they were brand new 40 years later. The Bible tells us that. God was attentive to the details, even though they weren't finding the capacity to trust him. And that plays in terms of how God works with you and I. It's okay if you can't trust God right now, because he's trusting you. And it's okay if you don't believe in God right now. He believes in you. But one day, you'll show up for your own rescue, and you'll realize, wow, not only can I believe in him, I can believe in me.
Believe in me. Melinda had a question right here. He answered it? Okay. Look at that. Right back here, please.
Put that guy on roller skates.
Yeah, then come
Or a
to Chris.
skateboard.
Then come to Chris afterwards.
My question, Dr. Logan, relates to what you were just speaking about, the Israelites in bondage for 400 years. Would you equate that to what we as black people are experiencing?
I'm a white guy. How do I answer that? Wow, but it's a great question. I'm going to respond to you the best way this white guy can do it. Because I really think that's a very important question. Here's what I know. And I mentioned this early on. Not only are we carrying around with us today programming based upon childhood experiences, we're carrying around in our lives things we've inherited that we're not even fully aware of. Now, there is a theology out there, and hang on, I'm about to make some of you happy, but I'm about to make some of you uncomfortable because you're going to disagree with what I'm about to say, and it's okay. I can't tell you any story except my story, right? So, there is a theology out there about generational curses, all right? What I'm about to say is not about that, okay? So I'm not talking about generational curses. What I am talking about is that if you go to Ancestry.com, if you go to FamilyTree.com, you can do a mouth swab and send them in these swabs, and they'll do a DNA test, and they'll tell you things about your family's history that goes back so far that it's unbelievable. In fact, there's 5 general groupings of all humanity on the planet since Noah. And we all fall into one of those 5 major groupings, okay? That's how precise DNA is. Well, how did I get that? Well, I inherited it. I may not be informed about it till I get a report, but there's a pathway to becoming informed about what I've inherited. I didn't ask for it, I didn't sign up for it, and I didn't have to go through probate court, but nevertheless, I got it. So if you imagine a people group living in slavery for several hundreds of years, it's not just the oppression of the current taskmasters, whether or not they're benevolent or whether or not they're dictatorial, whether or not they're kind or whether or not they're evil. The fact that a people group is enslaved creates a programming, creates this ANS to react to certain stimuli. And some of that is inherited. During our years of pastoring, Melody and I and our family spent 10 months in Louisiana. And it was 10 of the most miserable months of my life. And my family, it is not something we like to look back upon. There were some good moments, but overall, it was very challenging. And it's really hard to tell you the story. Because if you've spent any time in Louisiana, and you've spent time in St. Louis, and if you've spent time in Boston, and you've spent time in Phoenix, you know that the way the black culture is in Louisiana is not like it is here in some other places. I could not get an African American person to look me in the eye. That's not just current culture. That's a hand-me-down. Because they felt like a hand-me-down. We lived in a little town called Alexandria, right in the middle of the state, about a couple hours or maybe an hour and a half north of Baton Rouge. And there was a little town outside of Alexandria called but it was disgusting, and it was hugely disrespectful. And it had a curfew at 5 o'clock on it. And that was in 1990. In 1990 in Pineville, the drinking fountains were still separated. In 1990 in Pineville, Louisiana. I can't tell you how disgusting that was. Well, yeah, I forgot who I was talking to. Forgive me. My point is that's inherited. So when you hear God sends you somebody and says, I'm going to lead you into liberty. Old programming says, what makes you so different from the next guy or the last guy? What makes you so special? And the tendency is to not trust. Why? Because this A&S is kicked in and I'm still in survival mode. That people group is still in survival mode. And there's no one anywhere more informed and more compassionate about that than God in heaven. You see, God did not have an adverse opinion about the Israelites who didn't enter into the promised land. He was disappointed. And they reaped some consequences of their choices. And in some ways, the Jewish people to this day are still reaping consequences because they didn't enter into the promised land the first time. But that consequences is not because God is angry with them or that they didn't measure up or they're bad. No. It's the consequences that comes because you're a traumatized people.
Yeah.
Recovery from trauma doesn't happen completely in one generation. God brings these people out of Egypt, and within just a few days they're at Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, it's not just the 10 commandments or the 10 words that Moses brings. He brings the 613 commandments of God for his people. This is God's constitution for his people. Because before they went into slavery, they moved to Egypt as a family. But when they left Egypt, they came out as a nation. You missed it.
Nope.
They went into what eventually became slavery as a family, but when they came out as a nation. And so God's covenant with his people at Sinai is his constitution. This is how you behave, not as a family, this is how you behave as a nation. Okay?
Wow.
And he makes his covenant with his people. Well, in that covenant, he teaches them that every person, and not just Jews, all nations are to be free people. But there's something else in these instructions that's mystifying when we read it in English. He also gives them instructions on how to treat their slaves. Well, wait a minute. Is God schizophrenic? On one hand, he is saying all people are supposed to be free, but then on the next hand, you're telling us how the masters are supposed to take care of their slaves. God gave them the power to change culture, but he knew they couldn't do it that day. But he gave them the power to change the culture. That's what the Constitution did at Sinai. It empowered God's people. And this is why prayer by itself isn't enough.
Right. Right.
Because God says, you want to be better? Then go help each other. Go heal each other. Go bless one another. Go serve one another. Stop asking me to do everything. I delegated to you. I don't want you to give it back to me. Stop giving it back over to me. I gave it to you. Keep it. It's yours. Now you go heal your people. You go heal your nation. And if you follow my covenant, my constitution, I will heal your land. I just need to give it over to the Lord. Stop it! God's got other things He's focused on. He doesn't want your stuff. He gave you the power. Now go do something with it. I don't know what to do. Then join in partnership with people. If you're by yourself, no wonder you're running through the wilderness trying to find handholds to get across the stream. Stop going through the forest alone. Team up.
Team up. Right
Like
here.
batter up.
We're gonna take Chris's question, then one more, and then I'm gonna let you all. Okay, well, two more, but that's gonna be $10 a piece. Go ahead.
Dr. Logan, do depression and anxiety come out of trauma, and what is the difference between that, or is there a difference between that and what we are now talking about as PTSD in our culture?
Depression is a really big umbrella for a lot of things. Okay? So if you're talking to a medical physician, a therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, and they diagnose you as depressed, or they diagnose a person with depression, that could be anything from situational depression to clinical depression and a lot of other nuances in between. Okay? Here's what we know from the last 20 years of research in the area of trauma and attachment trauma. Unresolved traumatic issues will lead to depression. Okay? PTSD is one kind of expression. PTSD exists as a terminology, post-traumatic stress disorder, because of the DSM-5. The DSM-5 is a manual that psychologists and psychiatrists and therapists use to code. It's a coding manual. Why is coding important? Because we want to get paid. So in order for your insurance to cover the visit and the doctor has diagnosed you with depression or PTSD or some other behavioral health issue, that has to be coded. So the DSM-5 manual exists solely for the purpose of coding so that the physician gets paid and the insurance company knows that they can pay and how much to pay and so forth. Otherwise, you're paying out of pocket. The DSM-5 and its predecessors, 4 and 3, these are all version names, is the essential tool in diagnosing. So if you were to look at a DSM-5 and look at the symptomologies, because all of this, they list the abnormalities or the issues, and then they list the symptomologies, and then whatever symptomology appears the most based upon the therapist's opinion. This is not an exact science. It's all based upon educated information. So the symptomology for depression, the symptomology for PTSD, the symptomology for bipolar, and the symptomology for ADHD are almost exact. So how do we know that the soldier, he or she, returning from the battlefield, has PTSD and they don't have ADHD? It's the opinion of the therapist who's making the diagnostic. Okay? Here's what we know. And this can lead to depression, but it can lead to some other things as well. Surprise. That's the essential issue in PTSD. And that is the essential issue in attachment trauma. Surprise. What do I mean? I'm back in the forest. I'm crossing over the stream. I grabbed hold of the limb because I thought it was secure. And I thought because it's secure, I'm going to get away from the bear. That's how I've got it figured. That's how I've got it imagined. And I have set my expectations accordingly. I reach for the limb. I'm in a full stride. It breaks off. I fall. I lose my momentum. And the bear is coming right on top of me. That's the surprise. You thought you were safe, and you're not. And it's the surprise element that is so challenging to get over. Because emotionally, if you're returning from a battlefield, if you're a woman who has survived a rape, and you find yourself in some similar context, or it emotionally feels like you're in a similar context, the tendency is to not trust any handrails that are presented by any person or any situation. I tend not to trust because the last time I trusted, I got surprised. And when I got surprised, I got hurt. So now I don't trust. And I have this hypervigilance about me. I'm always on guard. I can't enjoy the party that I got invited to because I'm on guard. If I'm not on guard, I could get surprised. And if I get surprised, I'll get hurt. Now, take that to its natural conclusion in my relationship with God, my relationship with spouse, my relationship with children, my relationship with others. I don't trust God in what He's asking me to do and what He's directing me to do because the last time I trusted, I got hurt. So we pull in and I self-isolate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, two more quick questions. Pastor Nikki, and then there's a young lady back here as well. So those two quick questions, and then we're going to conclude for the day.
It kind of falls in line with what you said, but when those flashbacks come, when those triggers come, what would be your recommendation as to how to deal or navigate through the rest of your life with that?
Yeah. So again, if I'm isolated, I'm alone, there's not much way to navigate. I'm just going to have to write it out. And when in writing that out, I put it in a reactive mode. I may react. One way is to isolate, but the other kind of reaction, remember, if I'm not calm, I'm on alert. If I'm not alert, then I'm freezing. And if I'm not freezing, I'm fighting or running away. So if I'm not pulling back and running away, I may be fighting. And my fighting might be verbal or it might be physical. It might be violent. Do I have the excuse of, well, I can't control myself? Well, legally, the courts will not accept that. Unless there's some other existing circumstances, the court won't accept that on a legal level. But if we're really concerned about getting better, then I need to start showing up for my own rescue. And my first step of showing up is to open myself up to people who tell me they care. Let's flip it to the other side. It's someone you care about who's flipping out. Okay? They're flipping their lid. They've lost control. What's the best thing? What's the best thing you can do? Set aside all judgments and shame. And I'm going to say to you what I say to every parent who's adopting a child from the Arizona foster care system or who's fostering a child from the Arizona foster care system. The first essential thing you have to do is help that child feel safe. That doesn't mean that you put locks on the doors and that you got them safe. That you already have. This is about helping them feel safe. This is not about intellect. See, there's a lock on the door. You're okay. See, I'm not hitting you. You're okay. That's verbal. By the way, verbal language comes from up here, not down here. I have to model without words in a way that he feels safe. The second thing, over time, the consistency of me helping him feel safe will begin to build trust. Meanwhile, all of my life lessons and all those pet little lectures I've got that I think are so cute, shove them. Seriously, shove them. Because we're going to spend a lot of time here, maybe a few years, helping him feel safe. Help him feel safe. Remember, it's slinky time. Every time there's a trigger comes around, I got to start over. Help you feel safe. Okay. What happens when I'm helping him feel safe? He can see, I'm not on the battlefield anymore. The woman says, I'm not being raped. That was then. We're always helping them put a wedge in that emotion to see it. That was then. This is now. Does that help?
Amen. So we're going to take our final question back
this
there.
Is the $25,000.
$25,000 question.
Someone paid it for you. I'm okay.
And then we're going to let you go. Amen.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana. Okay.
Wow.
So when you got on that subject, okay. So what I'm saying is, and I kind of got a little thrown off a little bit because I'm listening to everything that you're saying, and then I pretty much forgot some things.
You went somewhere, didn't you?
I went back home, and I came back.
That's a trigger.
Yeah.
Nothing's broken, people.
Yeah.
Allow me to interrupt you for just a second. Nothing, what she's talking about, how many of you had that same thing happen when I was talking about my experience in Louisiana? Nothing's broken, but it was your childhood, and it was your you connected. We all do that. Nothing's broken. That's exactly the way God designed it. I'm sorry, go
Yes,
ahead.
and yes, I'm very much connected because of the things that goes on out there. It is really real. Like you said, you've seen a sign. People are very oppressed out there. Okay, I came out here due to the Katrina storm. Okay, but the way things is, as I go back home, time and time again, everything is getting worse instead of getting better. So you do pray. You have saints that praise and seriously pray. Okay? You got saints that's out there that's praying. Nobody's doing anything. And I'm not saying, fight and get physical and stuff like that. They'll pray, and just like you say, okay, you're waiting for God to do something. So when do they step out? And I find a lot of Christian people, okay, that pray and talk about the Lord, but ignore the things that's going on around in the city. And that's disgusting, okay? I want to go back and do some things, but I don't know what God is doing right now for me. I'm at a standstill, but I'm trying to decide on what I want to do because of the killings and things that's going on out there. It's not a pretty sight to see. I'm not advertising New Orleans. No, I'm not. Okay? They advertise, you go out there, have fun, the good food and stuff like that. That city is horrible. And, people need to be praying instead of going out there. It's a 24-hour partying city, drink all day, all night. That is disgusting to me. There's more to life than that God has given us. So my thing is when you were saying what you're saying, it kind of like hit me because that's my hometown. I love the people out there. They're friendly people, good people, But my prayer is that God touch all the saints out there and kind of like, and I ask you all to pray with me with that too.
Amen.
That God touch the saints to go out and reach the people because it's just horrible. And I just come back like last week. I was out there and everything is just getting worse. It's not getting any better, but everybody wants to drink and have fun. And this is not the time and the place for all of that. It's just too much going on. People need to seriously be praying. And I know the Bible said men are to always pray. Don't you just pray for one thing or some things every day, every night, anytime you could get up praying, we have to pray because, you know, we're at this end time and we just can't stop doing what we do. My life, I don't know, you know, so now I'm trying to find myself in a way with the Lord, whereas, you know, what he has me to do. If I need to go back home or if I have to stay out here, I don't know. But you know, you guys pray for me, okay? I just wanted you all to know that. It just touched base with me at home because you said you see the sign. You know, I had 2 sons that got beat by the police. And I raised my sons. They're good boys, you know? And so I thank God because he kept a hedge around them. And, you know, I have my son, he have a business where he makes herbal drinks. They beat him for no reason at all. Around the same time the next year, they beat my other son. And I'm just kind of like fed up with some things. And I'm asking God, why? I don't understand. I'm saying, why? Why? I don't know. So I just ask you all just put my strength in the Lord and, you know, just continue to pray and get direction and move on what you have to do. Don't just sit there. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for
Thank
your
you.
courage for sharing that today. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Listen, let's give Dr. Logan a hand this morning,
Thank you.
this afternoon.
Thank you.
Come on and stand up on your feet this morning if you would. Please, we want to dismiss you all